America had no food safety laws until 1906. What were you really eating? Here's something that might surprise you. For the first 130 years of this country's existence, there was no federal law telling a food company it couldn't put anything it wanted into what you ate. Not one. Chalk in your bread. Formaldehyde in your milk. Coal tar dye in your candy to make it look fresher than it was. A baby crying from teething pain might be quieted with a soothing syrup. That was, in plain terms, morphine in a bottle. If you bought a jar of honey in 1890, there was a real chance it wasn't honey at all. Just glucose syrup dressed up in a label. This is the story of how the United States government finally decided that what was inside the can mattered as much as what was printed on it, and how long and how many bodies it took to get there. Origins. To understand why nothing was regulated, you have to understand what regulation even meant to the people who founded this country. The United States was built by people deeply suspicious of centralized power. The Constitution said almost nothing about commerce in food or medicine, because in an agrarian society most families grew, raised, or traded for what they ate within a few miles of home. If your neighbor sold you bad milk, you knew where he lived. Trust was local and so was accountability. That system made a kind of sense in 1790. It made none at all by 1890. The Industrial Revolution didn't just build factories, it built distance. Distance between the person who made your food and the person who ate it. By the late 19th century, food was no longer something you traded with a neighbor. It was something manufactured in a city you'd never visit, shipped in a rail car you'd never see, and sold under a brand name designed by people whose only real product was the label itself. The very same railroads and refrigeration technology that made mass food production possible also made mass food fraud invisible. A tin of potted chicken could be manufactured in Chicago, travel 1,000 miles, and land on a table in Ohio, and there was no inspector standing at any point along that chain who had legal authority to open the can and check. States tried to fill the gap. By the 1880s and 1890s, a patchwork of state food laws existed. Some fairly strict, most toothless, almost none enforced with any consistency. A state health board might employ a single overworked chemist responsible for testing every suspicious product sold within its borders, with no budget to prosecute even the violations that chemist actually found. And state law stopped at the state line. A product banned in Massachusetts could simply be shipped from a plant in Illinois, because Congress had never claimed the authority to regulate what crossed state borders in a can or a bottle. Manufacturers understood this better than anyone, and some built their entire business model around it. The scale of the food industry itself was changing just as fast. What had once been small, local slaughterhouses consolidated into massive centralized packing complexes designed for volume above all else. Assembly line efficiency applied to meat years before Henry Ford applied it to automobiles. That consolidation cut costs and lowered prices, which was good for consumers on paper. But it also meant a single contaminated batch, a single unsanitary practice, or a single cost-cutting shortcut could now reach a scale no local health inspector had ever been built to handle. Meanwhile, an entirely separate industry had grown up around the same lack of oversight: patent medicine. The term was a holdover from British law. A letter's patent once granted a monopoly on a secret formula, but by the American Gilded Age, patent medicine simply meant any bottled remedy sold without a prescription, a doctor, or an ingredient label. This was, by any measure, big business. One contemporary estimate, likely exaggerated but telling all the same, put annual American spending on these remedies at $75 million a year, in an era when a factory worker might earn $400 annually. Adjusted for modern inflation, that $75 million would be worth well over $2.5 billion today. Some of that money bought vegetable tonics that did nothing. A great deal of it bought products laced with alcohol, opium, morphine, or cocaine, substances that made the customer feel better within minutes, guaranteeing they'd buy the bottle again. This was the country food regulation was born into: a nation with no federal food law, a patchwork of unenforced state statutes, an industrial supply chain built for anonymity, and an unregulated drug trade hiding in plain sight on pharmacy shelves. Nobody had built this system out of malice. It had simply never been built at all, and into that vacuum, for decades, American manufacturers were free to put whatever cost the least and sold the best. Part of what made this possible was a deep cultural suspicion of the medical profession itself. In the years after the American Revolution, A populist strain of thinking took hold that rejected trained physicians and pharmacists as elitist holdovers from British colonial rule, in favor of home remedies and self-treatment that felt distinctly, defiantly American. By the 1840s, manufacturers had figured out how to turn that populist instinct into a business model, mass-producing vegetable compounds and tonics and securing trademarks for their formulas the way a modern company might trademark a logo. The federal government had no framework for questioning any of it, because questioning it would have meant asserting exactly the kind of centralized authority the country had been founded to avoid. What looks, in hindsight, like reckless government neglect was, at the time, a direct and mostly unquestioned extension of the country's founding philosophy, which is precisely why it took a crisis, rather than an argument, to unwind it. Escalation. The first real national crisis came not from a grocery shelf, but from a war. In the spring of 1898, the United States went to war with Spain, and the army needed to feed tens of thousands of soldiers fast. Secretary of War Russell Alger's department turned to a new and largely untested method. Canned and refrigerated beef, shipped from Chicago packing houses to Cuba and Puerto Rico. It was cheaper and faster than the Army's old practice of buying live cattle near the front and slaughtering them locally. It was also, according to the men who had to eat it, close to poison. Picture a mess tent in Puerto Rico in the summer heat of 1898. A quartermaster cracks open a tin of the Army's canned beef ration. The smell that rises isn't the smell of meat. It's chemical, sharp, and wrong. Soldiers who'd been eating hardtack for weeks force it down anyway, because the alternative is going hungry in a combat zone. Some of the refrigerated beef arrives even worse. Gray, slick, reeking of something men can only compare to a funeral parlor. Roughly 327 tons of that refrigerated beef made it to Puerto Rico that summer. When the fighting ended, the numbers told their own story. Combat killed under 300 American soldiers in the entire war. Disease and illness, a category that included foodborne sickness alongside yellow fever and dysentery, killed nearly 10 times that many. Major General Nelson Miles, the Army's own commanding general, testified to a formal government inquiry, the Dodge Commission, that the meat should be called embalmed beef, his word for it, based on a report from an Army medical officer who said the beef smelled like a corpse treated with formaldehyde and tasted, when cooked, like decomposed boric acid. Miles couldn't fully prove every claim to the commission's satisfaction, and the packing companies denied wrongdoing. The Dodge Commission, led by Major General Grenville Dodge, spent months traveling to nearly 20 cities and Army posts collecting testimony, and its final report stopped short of confirming that the beef had literally been chemically embalmed. But officers on the ground didn't need a commission to tell them what they'd watched happen in front of them. One colonel testified that meat from the canned rations turned putrid inside the tin, discovered rotting the moment a can was opened. The scandal became a national news story for months regardless of the commission's final hedge, and for the first time ordinary Americans who had never worried about their own dinner started wondering what, exactly, refrigerated beef meant when nobody outside the factory was allowed to check. That question didn't go away. It got louder. Throughout the early 1900s, muckraking journalists, a new breed of reporter built for the mass circulation magazine era, started digging into exactly what was legal to sell. In 1905, Samuel Hopkins Adams began publishing a series in Collier's Weekly called The Great American Fraud, an 11-part takedown of the patent medicine industry. Adams didn't just say the tonics didn't work. He published lab analyses. He named brands. He calculated how much alcohol, opium, and cocaine were hiding in bottles marketed to nervous mothers and ailing grandmothers, sold under names meant to sound gentle and medicinal. The exposé landed like a bomb in American living rooms because it wasn't accusing some distant war contractor, it was accusing the bottle sitting on the family shelf. The advertising itself had been built specifically to exploit fear and shame. Trade cards, free calendars, and pamphlets full of fabricated testimonials targeted women in particular, playing on Victorian-era anxieties about weak constitutions and unspoken reproductive ailments that polite society wouldn't let a woman discuss openly with a male doctor. One widely sold tonic promised relief from chronic diseases common to their sex. Another asked mothers waiting to treat a sick child why they'd wait until disease showed its blight on some flower of your little flock. Behind the flowery language sat the same chemistry batch after batch. Alcohol, opium, morphine, sometimes cocaine, cheap to produce, physically habit-forming, and virtually guaranteed to bring the customer back for another bottle once the effect wore off. It wasn't just fraud. It was fraud engineered for repeat business. But it was fiction, strangely enough, that finally forced Washington's hand. In the fall of 1904, a 26-year-old socialist writer named Upton Sinclair boarded a train to Chicago. He wasn't investigating food safety. He was investigating labor, specifically, the brutal conditions endured by immigrant workers in the meatpacking district known as Packingtown, a sprawling complex of stockyards, slaughterhouses, and tenement housing that employed roughly 25,000 people and processed something on the order of 14 million animals a year. For 7 weeks, Sinclair put on grimy clothes, carried a lunch pail, and walked into the plants posing as a worker. What he witnessed became the novel The Jungle, serialized in 1905 and published in book form in 1906. Sinclair wanted readers to weep for the exploited Lithuanian immigrant family at the center of his story. Instead, in a twist that frustrated him for the rest of his life, readers fixated on roughly 8 pages describing what actually went into the meat. Sinclair described dead rats swept into sausage grinders alongside spoiled scraps. He described diseased cattle slaughtered and sold as prime beef with nobody the wiser. He described filth scraped off factory floors being reprocessed and sold as potted ham. Whether every specific detail in the novel was a literal transcription of what Sinclair witnessed or a dramatized composite has been debated by historians for over a century, but government investigators sent to verify his claims came back describing conditions bad enough to turn their own stomachs, and that was enough. Sinclair later said, in a line that's been quoted for generations, that he had aimed for the nation's heart and hit it in the stomach instead. Consider what Sinclair was actually walking into during those 7 weeks. Most of Packingtown's workforce by 1904 was made up of recent immigrants from Poland, Slovakia, and Lithuania, crammed into tenement housing pressed directly against the stockyards and, not far off, for separate city dumps. These were people with almost no leverage, language barriers, no savings, and employers who could replace an injured or complaining worker within the hour from the next boat of arrivals. Sinclair had actually been sent to Chicago to cover a meatpacker strike for a socialist newspaper called Appeal to Reason. The plan was to write about labor exploitation, not food contamination. But once he was inside those plants day after day, watching what actually went into the product before it reached a train car bound for grocery stores nationwide, the story he came back with was impossible to separate from what was happening on America's dinner plates. The public reaction proved his editors right about one thing. Readers who could shrug off a stranger's 12-hour shift could not shrug off the thought of what might be in their own sausage. By 1906, the pressure had been building for over 2 decades from an unlikely source inside the government itself. A government chemist who had been trying, and failing, to get Congress to act since the 1880s. His name was Harvey Washington Wiley, and what he did next turned him into one of the strangest and most effective reformers in American history. The fight/turning point. Harvey Wiley wasn't an obvious candidate to become the most important consumer advocate in American history. Born in 1844 on a farm near Kent, Indiana, his education was interrupted by a year of service in the Union Army during the Civil War. He eventually earned a medical degree, then realized fairly quickly that treating patients wasn't the work he wanted, chemistry was. He taught chemistry, served as Indiana state chemist, and got his first real exposure to food fraud analyzing sugars and syrups sold across the state. By the time he became chief chemist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Wiley had already spent the better part of 2 decades documenting food adulteration through a 10-part federal study called Food and Food Adulterants, published between 1887 and 1902. He had the evidence. What he didn't have for most of those years was a Congress willing to act on it. Harvey Wiley had a problem that any reformer would recognize. He believed the chemical preservatives flooding into American food, borax, formaldehyde, salicylic acid, copper sulfate, were dangerous. But belief wasn't proof, and without proof, there was no case for a federal law. So in 1902, as chief chemist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Wiley convinced Congress to fund an experiment nobody had ever tried before. He would feed the chemicals directly to healthy human volunteers and measure exactly what happened. Wiley recruited about a dozen young men, government employees and Georgetown medical students, all volunteers, all fully informed of what they were signing up for, and set up a kitchen, dining room, and laboratory in the basement of the Agriculture Department building in Washington. He hired a chef named Perry to prepare full, appetizing meals. Then he laced those meals, dose by careful dose, with the preservatives under investigation. Before and after every meal, the volunteers were weighed, their pulse and temperature recorded, and their urine and stool samples analyzed. It was slow, methodical, unglamorous science. The Washington press had no interest in slow and methodical. They nicknamed Wiley's volunteers the Poison Squad, and the name stuck instantly. The men themselves leaned into it, adopting the motto, "Only the brave dare eat the fare." And a poet even wrote them a mock heroic rhyme about breakfasting on acid and dining on formaldehyde. One surviving Christmas dinner menu from 1902 lists turkey, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, and rice pudding, with the word borax printed after nearly every single dish, because that was the additive on the menu that week. It reads almost like a joke today. It was deadly serious research. Over 5 years of trials running from 1902 to 1907, Wiley documented real, measurable harm. Borax, one of the first substances tested, produced headaches and stomach pain in volunteers at doses well, within what an average family might unknowingly consume from adulterated butter or preserved meat. When some volunteers realized they could identify the borax by taste and simply avoid swallowing their full dose, Wiley adjusted the protocol, switching to gelatin capsules and stationing observers at the table to make sure every dose was actually ingested. A small but telling detail about just how rigorous and how strange this early government science had to become. Preservative after preservative went through the same process. Formaldehyde, salicylic acid, copper sulfate, sulfurous acid, each fed to healthy young men, each one measured against the same basic question. Is this something the government should let a manufacturer put into food sold to a family with no way of knowing it was there at all? Wiley had science. What he needed was a public willing to act on it. And by 1905 and 1906, between Adams's Great American Fraud series and the outrage over the jungle, he finally had one. Newspapers that had ignored food safety for decades couldn't stop covering it. Consumer groups organized. The American Medical Association, tired of watching untrained quacks undercut its members, threw its weight behind federal legislation. And crucially, President Theodore Roosevelt, who had read an advance copy of Sinclair's novel and was reportedly disgusted by it, sent his own investigators to Chicago to verify the claims, then used the confirmed report as political leverage to push a bill through a Congress that had been stalling similar legislation for years. Still wasn't easy. The relevant bill, sponsored by Senator Weldon Haben of Idaho, had been introduced back in December 1905. It passed the Senate in February 1906 by a wide margin, 63-4, but stalled for months in the House, where meatpacking and patent medicine lobbies fought it hard behind closed doors. It took a floor speech from Illinois Representative James Mann, in June 1906, holding up actual adulterated products in front of his colleagues to help shake the bill loose from committee. Mann brought physical evidence onto the House floor. Cherries that had been picked green, stripped of their natural color with acid until they were nearly white, then dyed back to a cherry red that had nothing to do with the fruit's original chemistry. It was a simple, visceral piece of theater, and it worked precisely because it made an abstract regulatory debate suddenly, uncomfortably tangible for men who ate the same groceries their constituents did. The House finally passed it on June 20, 1906, by a vote of 143 to 72. A joint conference committee reconciled the House and Senate versions within days. On June 30, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed 2 landmark bills into law on the very same afternoon: the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act. For the first time in American history, it was a federal crime to ship adulterated or fraudulently labeled food or drugs across state lines. The system that had let a company in Illinois legally sell poison to a family in Ohio, simply because no federal law said otherwise, was over. Resolution. Here's what the 1906 law actually did in concrete terms. It banned adulteration, mixing food or drugs with cheaper, inferior, or outright harmful substitutes, like cottonseed oil sold as olive oil, or sawdust bulked into ground spices. It banned misbranding, false or misleading labeling, and it required, for the first time, that any product containing one of 11 specified dangerous substances, alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, heroin, chloroform, and cannabis among them, actually say so on the label. The Companion Meat Inspection Act put federal inspectors inside slaughterhouses and packing plants for the first time, with authority to condemn diseased animals before they ever reached a grinder. Harvey Wiley's Bureau of Chemistry became the agency responsible for enforcing it all, the direct ancestor of what would eventually be renamed, in 1931, the Food and Drug Administration. Now, here's what it didn't fix, because this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, and where the channel signature nuance matters most. The 1906 law required accurate labeling. It did not require the label to be true in any meaningful medical sense. A company could still sell a bottle of colored sugar water and call it a cancer cure, and as long as it didn't misstate the actual ingredients, the law had nothing to say about it, because false curative claims weren't covered at all, only false ingredient claims. That loophole let the patent medicine trade limp on for years, simply rebranding old scams as new tonics and compounds, some of them now marketed as diet cures with invented names designed to sound like doctors' prescriptions rather than snake oil. Congress didn't close that specific gap until the Shirley Amendment in 1912, and even that amendment only banned false claims that could be proven fraudulent with clear intent to deceive, which was a legal bar difficult to clear in court. Enforcement itself was also weaker than it looked on paper. The Bureau of Chemistry could seize adulterated goods and refer cases for prosecution, but it was a small agency asked to police an enormous, fast-growing national market, and manufacturers quickly learned which violations actually drew federal attention and which ones didn't. A separate provision let companies voluntarily stamp their products with a federal guarantee number claiming compliance with the new law, a badge of legitimacy that consumers trusted, but that was, in practice, self-reported by the manufacturer rather than independently certified by government inspectors before the product ever reached a shelf. That guarantee system stayed in place until 1918, more than a decade after the law's passage. There was another gap, subtler but just as consequential: the distinctive name loophole. If a manufacturer sold an imitation product under its own invented brand name, rather than claiming to be the real thing, it only had to disclose that it was a blend or compound, buried in fine print. A jam that was 80% corn syrup and 20% fruit could dodge real scrutiny simply by never calling itself jam on the label in the first place. And the 1906 Act had no mechanism at all for proving a drug was actually safe before it hit the market, only that its label wasn't lying about what was in it. Nobody had to prove a product worked, or that it wouldn't hurt you, only that the ingredient list was honest. That gap would prove fatal decades later. Modern throughline. This isn't ancient history. This is your great-grandparents' generation, and the gap the 1906 law left open didn't get closed by good intentions. It got closed by another body count. In 1937, a pharmaceutical company created a liquid version of a new antibiotic, sulfanilamide, using a solvent called diethylene glycol to help it dissolve, a chemical we now know as a component of antifreeze. Because the 1906 law never required pre-market safety testing, nobody was legally obligated to check whether that solvent was safe for humans to drink before it shipped to pharmacies nationwide. It wasn't. Over 100 people died, a significant number of them children, before the product was pulled. That tragedy, not persuasive journalism, not a best-selling novel, but dead children in numbers too large to ignore, is what finally pushed Congress to pass the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, the law that first required manufacturers to prove a drug was safe before it could be sold at all. Look at the through line. Adulterated food in 1906 forced labeling. A poison drug in 1937 forced safety testing. Neither reform came from foresight. Both came from a body count large enough and public enough that inaction became more politically costly than action. That pattern, react to catastrophe rather than anticipate it, didn't end in 1938. It's the same pattern behind the Kefauver-Harris amendments of 1962, passed after the thalidomide crisis. It's arguably the same pattern behind every major consumer safety reform since. Every ingredient list you glance at in a grocery aisle today, the calorie count, the allergen warning, the recall notice on your phone when a batch of lettuce turns out to be contaminated, sits on top of a regulatory structure that traces directly back to a chemist feeding borax to volunteers in a basement, and a socialist novelist who wanted to write about labor and ended up rewriting the nation's food supply instead. None of that structure was inevitable. It was built, slowly and reluctantly, out of scandal after scandal, by a government that had spent its first century actively avoiding exactly this kind of authority. So here's the open question, and it's not one this channel is going to answer for you. Is that pattern a flaw we've simply never engineered out of American regulation? Or is it the only mechanism in a system built on limited government and corporate lobbying power that has ever actually worked? The next time you read an ingredient label, remember that every word on it exists because, at some specific point in history, somebody had to get sick or die before a law made that word mandatory. If this story changed the way you'll read a nutrition label the next time you're standing in a grocery aisle, hit subscribe or drop a like. It helps more than you'd think. We go deep on the hidden systems, the money, and the power most people never think twice about. I'll see you in the next one.